reason number one, very simple, very succinct, right? I'm going to try to keep this as simple as is possible, is the universe and time itself had a, what's that word? Had a beginning. The universe and time itself had a beginning. That's why we use the word time to summarize. We're going to talk about the nature of time. Do you have any time to talk about the nature of time? Right? Do you have just a moment? Let's talk about the nature of time. The universe and time itself had a beginning. Well, first of all, the Bible opens with this very idea. The Bible opens with this arresting idea that is absolutely transformational in the human psyche and in all of human literature. This idea that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Right? The Bible opens with this idea that the heavens and the earth, aka the universe, the cosmos, that all of it had a beginning. And I'm suggesting here, and we're gonna begin to marshal our evidence, that it's not just things that are extended in space, like planets and stars and suns and all of these sort of cosmic things that have a beginning. Time itself had a beginning along with the universe. So let's talk about that. I'm going to give you several quotations tonight from well-known, world-renowned, respected scientists. I'm going to start by telling you about a man by the name of Arno Allen Penzias. Now, Arno Allen Penzias is a theoretical physicist and astronomer, and he is most famous for having discovered what's called cosmic microwave background radiation. Now, if you're sitting here today and you don't know what cosmic microwave background radiation is, that's okay. But basically what Penzias discovered is this idea that there was an evidentiary basis, that there's some reason to believe that there was what's sometimes called a Big Bang, right? That there was a beginning. That term, Big Bang, was actually a term that was coined as a pejorative, as a way of making the idea seem absurd and ridiculous. But it caught on. It's got a nice alliteration to it. When the idea was presented that the universe had a beginning at some big explosive event that was called, again, mockingly and pejoratively, the Big Bang, most physicists said, that's crazy. That's absurd. The universe has always been, will always be. The universe is eternal. Not only is it eternal, it's infinite, or at least as near as we can tell, it's infinite. And yet there were some scientists in the 40s and 50s and 60s that began to say, you know what, we think, in fact, the universe is not eternal, it's not infinite, it's actually expanding. Well, that raises all kinds of questions, philosophical questions. How can something that's already eternal and infinite be expanding? The question would be raised, into what is it expanding? How can something that's already infinite and eternal grow into something else? What exactly is it growing into? And so when this idea was begun to be put forth, that the universe was finite in time, that it had a definitive beginning, many physicists regarded it as absurd and absolutely unwarranted. The belief was unwarranted by the evidence. But Penzias discovered this cosmic microwave background radiation, which in short form is the residual energy left over from the cosmic beginning, the primordial beginning. Now, what's fascinating here, and I don't expect you to instantly understand cosmology or astrophysics, but what I want you to hear is something that Penzias said in 1978, the year that he won the Nobel Prize in physics for his discovery of the cosmic microwave background radiation. This is what he said. My argument is that the best data we have are exactly what I would have predicted. Had I nothing to go on but the 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole. In other words, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Penzias says the scientific data that we have, the astrophysical data that we have, is what I would have expected if all I had was the books of Moses and the Psalms and basically the Old Testament. Now, in 1978, the New York Times interviewed Penzias and did an article on his discovery of the cosmic microwave background radiation. Part of that was a confession or a conversion of Sir Frederick Hoyle. Now, Hoyle was himself an astrophysicist and was the one who had actually coined the term Big Bang as a term of mockery and, it was dismissive of the Big Bang. Now notice what the article says here. New York Times, March 12, 1978. Sir Fred Hoyle, the cosmologist who proposed a steady state universe, a universe that always has been and is, no changes, no fluxes, no expansion, right, was with neither beginning nor end, was compelled by the observations of Dr. Penzias to abandon his theory. Penzias continues, the thing I am most interested in now, Dr. Penzias said in an interview, is whether the universe is open or closed. What do you mean by that, Dr. Penzias, whether the universe is open or closed? If it is open, that is, expanding forever from a single great explosion of Genesis. Notice what he says here. And the data seems to indicate that it is open. This is precisely the universe that organized religion predicts. Now, this is not scripture. This is not a pastor. This is not a preacher. This is a Nobel Prize-winning physicist saying the best scientific data that we have is consistent with what we have in scripture. If all we had was Moses and the Psalms and the Old Testament, this is what we would have expected. A cosmic beginning, an explosive beginning that causes time and the universe and time itself to proceed forth from that ultimate beginning. Now think about it this way. If I ask you to count to 10, you could do that, no problem, right? You could say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. If I ask you to count to 100, you could do that very readily. If I ask you to count to 1,000, you could do that. If I ask you to count to 10,000, you could do that. Even if I ask you to count to 1,000,000, you could count to 1,000,000 if you had enough time to do it, right? In fact, you could count to any finite number if you had enough time to do it, right? But if I ask you to count to infinity, could you do that? No, you can't count to infinity, because when you had counted forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever, and it seemed like you were just about ready to arrive, there would be an infinity yet beyond. Right? Now think about that for just a moment. Notice what I've put up here on the screen. There could not have been an infinite number of days before today, or we could have never arrived at today. Now just think that through. I don't know exactly how many days, and we can divide time up into any kind of, nomenclature that we want here. We can say days, we can say years, we can say moments, we can say seconds, we can say hours, we can say decades. It doesn't matter. We're going to use days because it's easy. I don't know how many days there were before today. I don't know how many days it is back to the Big Bang. But the point is this. It sure seems like it couldn't have been an infinite number of days, because if there had been an infinite number of days or of minutes or of seconds or of moments before today, how could we have ever gotten to today? If an actual infinity cannot be traversed, how could we have arrived at today if there was an infinite number of days before today? And the answer is, we very likely couldn't have. There seems to be no mathematical way that we could have traversed an actual infinity to have arrived at today. But lo and behold, here we are. And so what we have is a sequence, right? Today is, whatever the day is, let's say it's the 20th, and then the day before that would be the 19th, and then the 18th, and then the 17th. And if we just keep working back, there always would have been a yesterday. There always would have been a yesterday until you got to the first ever day. And we couldn't have had an infinite number of days before that first ever day, or we could have never gotten to this day. It's really quite fascinating. So not only is there really good scientific reason to think that the universe had a beginning, there's really good philosophical, mathematical reason to understand that the universe, in fact, had a beginning. This man here is a mathematician himself. He's a professor. His name is David Berlinski, one of my favorite secular writers. And he wrote in a really great book called The Devil's Delusion these words. He says, the universe has not proceeded from everlasting to the everlasting. The cosmological beginning, all the way back to that thing that is we call the Big Bang, he says the cosmological beginning may be obscure, but it is finite in time. What he means by obscure is we're not quite sure. Even physicists and cosmologists, they don't know if they're describing a theoretical concept. They don't know if they're describing an actual thing in which all of the mass of the universe was shrunk down to something that's, fractionally the size of the head of a pin. Did this actually happen, or is it just a theoretical construct? And so what Berlinski is saying here is, we don't know exactly what it was, but what we do know is that there was some event, some what he calls cosmological beginning. He continues. This is something. that until the 20th century was not known, until people like Penzias and others began to make discoveries that corroborated the finitude of the universe. He said, man, this is something that was not known until the 20th century. When it became known, it astonished the community of physicists and everyone else. People were like, what? What do you mean the universe had a beginning? And then Berlinski concludes with this awesome line, simple line, amazing line. He says, the hypothesis of God's existence and the facts of contemporary cosmology are consistent. There is a consistency there. There is not a hostility. They do not stand in contradiction. This ancient Mosaic idea that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, some 3,000 years later after Moses wrote those words, is actually being held up and buttressed and confirmed by the findings of scientists who need all kinds of computers and gadgetry to arrive at these conclusions. Berlinski says, you know what? Nobody knew, but what we now know is that the facts of contemporary cosmology and the idea of a beginning of the universe in terms of God or the Bible or religion, he says there's a consistency there, not a contradiction. This is Robert Jastrow. He is a late scientist. He's passed away, I think, in 2008, scientist at NASA, also an astronomer. And this is one of my favorite quotations to this effect. And I think you'll really like this. Jastrow says, for the scientist who has lived his life by faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. The scientist has scaled the mountains of ignorance, and he is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. Just as we're about ready to come to a scientific awareness of the nature of the universe and the origin of the universe, he's like, man, there's already a bunch of people there and they're holding Bibles. There's a bunch of theologians on the top of that mountain. And so the idea of time, that the universe and time itself had a beginning, is one very persuasive. It's one piece of the puzzle. It's not all of it, but it's one piece of the puzzle that strongly suggests that the idea that there is a God is not a fairy tale idea. It's not a ridiculous idea. It's not an idea that has no defensibility or reasonability. In fact, it's consistent, in the words of Berlinski, with the facts of contemporary cosmology.